Hello, dears, this is the StorySculpt channel, and you are listening to the story Godfather by Khadija Mastoor. This story is translated by Aamer Hussein in the book KAHANI, Short Stories by Pakistani Women, edited by Aamer Hussein in 2005. The hideous midnight silence seemed to whisper a murderous plot. And Godfather walked with assurance down the middle of the tarmac street as if it was made just for her. Guardian sentries whistled, somewhere nearby. A strange terror emanated from the menacing silence. Godfather was oblivious to the sounds of the whistles. The metal head of her walking stick ground the tarmac and her heavy, masculine boots made a racket. Despair dripped from her face. She sighed deeply, over and over again, then looked at the sky with weary eyes as if there, too, hung a heavy lock. She was muttering something, swearing or praying, who knows? The sentries were approaching her now, but she strode on, step upon balanced step, with the same steadiness. "Who are you?" The voice was so near, she had to stand still. There was such despair and grief in the way she stood, perhaps she didn't want to stand. The sentry ogled her, amazed. Such a strapping figure of a woman, stick in hand, wearing men's shoes and a big loose shirt, enormous, wide-trousered shalwar and no dupatta. Godfather remained silent for a moment, watching the gawping soldier, as if to say, "Brother, let me walk my fill today." The soldier turned and let out a loud whistle. The sentry's footsteps came nearer. "Who are you? Are you dumb? Is that why you won't speak?" the soldier yelled, and his voice smudged into the far distance. "Why are you bothering me, my man? Get on with your business." Godfather said quietly. "Mind my own business, you slag. Tell me who you are." The sentry pounced on her. "I'm your father, you bastard." She came to life, bashing the pavement with her stick. The fragility of the world seemed to turn into a curse, beating on her face like rain. The sentry hissed an obscenity. "Come on, to the station." Roaming around at 2:00 in the morning with a truncheon. "Slag. You'll take me to the station, will you?" She fell on the soldier. "Take me to the station." "I'll show you, take me to the station." She dusted his leg with her stick. Then, as he fearfully went for his truncheon, she brought it down on him with such force that she split open his head. Its metal tip scattered his brain around. She was muttering who knows what, under her breath. In the sallow, insipid moonlight, the living, pulsing blood flowed black. The steps of the other sentries sounded close. Bemused, Godfather saw the blood and her feet lifted, ready to run. She had only gone a few paces when 6 soldiers surrounded her, divested her of her cane and handcuffed her. Leaving 2 soldiers to guard the corpse, the other 4 flanked her, 2 on each side, and set off for the nearby station. The soldiers spoke about their dead companion and swore at Godfather. But she walked silently, thinking who knows what. And the night seemed to spit with fury like the soldiers. Godfather was detained at the station for 3 days. They didn't need to investigate, she'd been in jail several times. They had her entire history. They kept her all those days just to find out why she hated the dead sentry, and to get her lover's address. She insisted she had no lover now, no acquaintances even. But no one believed her, and the female jailers gave her a sound thrashing. On the 4th day they put her in an armored car and transported her to prison, where she was shut in a cell until her case was decided. When Godfather was brought to that solitary cell, she wasn't laughing as usual, calling the cell a lovely house. She didn't tease or joke with the sentries but remained absolutely silent, and when the iron door of her cell was shut, she spread out a mat on the mud platform, placing her head where it had been raised to form a pillow. All day she stared silently at the ceiling. Some watery, split-pea lentils sat in an aluminium pot alongside 2 coarse, thick chapatis, trying to tempt her. At night, they force-fed her. But her demeanor didn't change much. Outside the iron door, guard duty was in progress. The yellow light of the lanterns glimmered from here to there. Barrack number 1, barrack number 2. Everything's fine, the female wardens' voices responded to each other. Godfather kept sighing. Perhaps today the memories of her life, begun in a meager household, had returned, bent on tormenting her. Perhaps that was what she replayed, lying in the dark, watching something. Those days when her father worked as a butler in a nearby house and her mother grumbled, eking out the month on 15 rupees. In those days her name was Kaniz, not Godfather. 15 rupees and 6 lives. She never had a stomachful to eat. So she had become quarrelsome. She never felt the slightest shame in grabbing her for sister's share of food, to fill her own belly. Mother would chastise her, citing the gratitude and restraint of her sisters, but come mealtimes, she pranced into the kitchen, forgetting all admonitions, and snatched their portions like a monkey. Mother consoled and cosseted her other offspring in their hunger. She cursed Kaniz and wished her evil. Kaniz cried as she watched Mother lavishing her affection on her siblings and, for a bit, withdrew into silence. But when she entered the kitchen she would again leap and prance, in the process smashing several of the clay pots and containers. Mother pounded her breast and once or twice even beat her with sticks of firewood. Yet when the women who lived round about criticized her and called her names, Mother said hopefully that she would grow out of it. But Kaniz's habits deteriorated. Around the age of 13, she was confined to Purdah, but her ways didn't alter a shred. Nor did her father's salary increase. Now she learned new tricks. She spent hours twisting her neck round the door of their servants' quarters, and when the women from the grand houses came out dressed in their finery, she'd clap loudly and start shouting, "I wish to God these eaters of pulio and sweet rice would die. I wish to God these wearers of finery would die." She would stop the traveling vendors of pakoras and sweets, then run in without buying anything, provoking their abuse. And one day she surpassed herself. She swore at the wife of her father's employer, cursing her for not increasing his salary. That day, he nearly lost his job. He was ordered to vacate the quarters, and it was only by falling at his mistress's feet and begging her to excuse the prating of an immature child that he continued to earn his crust. When father came home, he flogged her so severely with a stout stick, she couldn't leave her bed for days. After that the door was always locked. Around 15 she was, when mother arranged her marriage, to put her to rights. They borrowed 20 rupees and the preparatory period began. During that time, she didn't fight for food and radiance shone out of her face in spite of a half-empty stomach. Some of her friends had married recently and they told her that quite apart from food and new clothes, a bride receives the kind of love from her husband that no one else can give. After leaving for her husband's home, Kaniz forgot her past woes. Her husband loved her wholeheartedly and her mother-in-law was so caring that she fed Kaniz with her own hands, noon and night. But when she lifted her bridal veil and wanted to see the house, she realized she was only the mistress in name. The orders came from her horse-toothed mother-in-law. Her husband's 20 rupee salary was also handed over to his mother. Swiftly, she said farewell to her bridehood and tried to take control of the household. But her mother-in-law turned vicious as a witch. She locked Kaniz out of the room, which contained 3 enormous tin trunks, banned her from so much as peeping into the kitchen and wouldn't let her touch a penny of her husband's salary. That apart, she denied her the delicious tidbits that her husband pilfered from his master's kitchen. Consumed with jealousy, she began to measure out Kaniz's meals in mean portions, unconcerned that she was going hungry. Finally, Kaniz tried, gently, to fill her husband's ears, but he took offense. "If you say a single word about my mother, there'll be no one worse than I. My mother worked with her nose to the grindstone, trying to bring me up. Everything in this house is hers. For all her efforts to show her mother-in-law in a bad light and win her husband round to her way of thinking, Khadija only succeeded in alienating him. He began avoiding her. There were constant rows. She tormented her mother-in-law, who swore back at her, cried and screamed, day in and day out, and wasn't content even after gaining the sympathies of the entire neighborhood. Spitefully, she doled out such meager amounts of food to Khadija, it wasn't enough to line her belly. When Khadija pushed her way into the kitchen to eat, the hag's invective became ferocious. Her husband, fed up with the loud and constant bickering, hit her, and she wreaked her revenge on her mother-in-law. Despite her father's death, she threatened to leave home, and her mother-in-law, looking pleased, taunted, "Where can you go?" And true enough, Khadija's threat remained a threat. Then for a few days the fight stopped because she was due to have a baby. After a month's confinement, she arose from her bed with her infant in her arms, but her mother-in-law couldn't bear her to have the power acquired from mothering a son. Nor could she bear the thought of her only son falling under his wife's influence because of it. Khadija turned tigress. As soon as she was strong enough, she grabbed her mother-in-law by her hair and beat her. That night, her husband and mother-in-law snatched the suckling boy from her breast and threw her out. She didn't know the town, whose help to seek, where to find refuge. Tangled in her burqa, she was walking aimlessly, when the wife of the local Tongawala saw her. She had often visited Khadija and regaled her, in foul language, with the neighborhood gossip. Now she took her home and showed her great tenderness, but she could not stem her tears. Khadija beat her breast and wept, lamenting as she pointed to the drops of milk soaking through her shirt. That night when the Tongawala parked his horse and cart, his bizarre friends came uninhibitedly into the house, whispering and mumbling. Then they locked the doors and began to gamble and smoke pot. The wife sat with them on the floor smoking a reefer, then forced Khadija to have a whole one, too. This was her first experience of hashish. It blew her senseless and she fell on the bed, calling out to her baby, her jewel, all night. A few days later, when her tears had not yet abated, the Tongawala's wife told her that a friend of her husband's had fallen in love with her. Crying would not do. If she wanted to enjoy herself, she should run away with him. He was promising her a life of luxury. Khadija refused, insisting she wanted a reunion with her husband and mother-in-law. She would endure anything if they took her back. She'd go hungry but wouldn't say a word. If they forbade her to hold her baby, she wouldn't stretch out her arms. If she was told not to look at him, she'd blind herself. She just wanted to be near him. In the end, the Tongawala went to see her husband to get an agreement, but he returned with the divorce papers. Like a madwoman, Khadija tore her hair, pummeled her flesh, shrieked and cried. Her new lover consoled her with all his heart. The Tongawala tenderly reassured and sustained her with a flood of invective against her oppressors, but nothing made sense to her. She called to her baby all night, spoke to him, shrieked incessantly and smoked hashish. 2 weeks went by and eventually the Tongawala's wife said she could support her no longer. Khadija had a perfect suitor and she should set up home with him. So, at last, she agreed to leave on condition that she could see her jewel just one last time. But she discovered that her husband and his mother had moved to another town. After the news she neither cried nor lamented, just fell silent as if she'd turned to stone. The very next day her lover took her to a bleak, little-known alley of the town where she soon discovered that he made a living from theft. She didn't object. Whatever he brought home from the sleight of his hand, he cast into her lap. And though he laid himself out with adoration, she couldn't find a civil word to say to him. She swore at him at every turn, smoked heaps of hashish and languished in bed. But thieves and scoundrels just want a woman, and the wretch had found a woman after a long time. He wouldn't say an angry word to her. And many days passed that way. Confined to bed, she had herself examined by all the local midwives and found out quite quickly that she was infertile because her mother-in-law had skimped on a proper midwife. After this revelation, she became even stranger than before. She lay in bed, beat her breast, swore, smoked and ate so excessively that she messed up her system. A year later, she insisted that she would help her man by going to work for a rich woman. He was pleased with the idea and very soon taught her the simpler tricks of the trade. As a precaution, he also taught her to break locks, and a few days later, she relinquished her burqa and began staking out houses to make his job easier. Now the two were in clover. Instead of crying and lamenting, she laughingly devoured liters of milk and stopped being so nasty to her lover. Then, one day, who knows what got into her, instead of stealing her mistress's possessions, she abducted her suckling infant. But she was caught soon enough, smothering the child with kisses. She and her partner were jailed for 7 months each, with hard labor. They met after their release and returned to work in the obscure streets. But her partner warned her that if she did something so foolish again, she would die for nothing. A proper godfather doesn't get caught by the police. And when she asked him the meaning of Godfather, she learned that that was the name they used for crime lords in Bombay and that he had lived for quite a while with such crime lords. 2 or 3 days later, she demanded he call her Godfather in future. If he called her Khanis again, she would smash in both their skulls. Her lover tried to convince her that the title was inappropriate for women, but she repudiated her womanhood. After she assumed the name of Godfather, she started to stake out houses again and once, without consultation, burgled clumsily. She was imprisoned for a month and her lover was forced to suffer a 6-month sentence. This time when they met after their release, Godfather's behavior was more bizarre than ever before. So much so, that even her lover couldn't understand her. She would roam the streets in broad daylight wielding her stick. Her partner and his criminal friends warned her. She would get everyone in trouble if she carried on like this, but she didn't care. She wandered around, got smashed on pot and crashed out in bed. Finally, fed up with her ignoring all his pleas and warnings, her partner abandoned her. She lay hungry and thirsty for ages, watching the sky. That night she broke into a house with a big bang and ended up in jail for 6 months. When she was released, she sat hungry and thirsty in the lane where she had lived with her lover. As night fell, she arose, weary, and went to the house of an acquaintance who had given up crime. She begged some food from him and then, stealing the stick that stood in his porch, she left. Night's darkness was growing more hideous, but she walked along that tarmacked road, tapping her stick, thinking who knows what, and then very soon afterwards she was standing, staring at the sentry, as if to say, "Brother, let me walk my fill today, I'm in despair. Life feels tragic tonight. Let me walk." She spent a night and a day of silence in prison. The next day when she began peeping, like a cat, through the iron railing, there was not a shadow of grief on her face. When the warden passed her cell, she called out, "Oi! Say something, will you? You walk around like a machine." The warden walked past glaring and Godfather swore like a man and guffawed. Locked up in solitary, she was badly in need of hashish. On her previous spells in prison there had been no shortage of it. The lack of it unbalanced her. Her body ached so much, she fell ill. The prison doctor examined her but prescribed such bitter medicine that she smashed the bottle and leapt around the cell, frightening her. One day Godfather tried to suck up to the volunteer prisoner who was distributing the food. "Can I get some dope somewhere, sweetie?" "No," the volunteer said, but took pity on her and gave her 2 bidis. "If you get me some, I'll give you 2 rupees. Godfather tried bribing her with money she had managed to conceal in spite of all the searches. "No. My God, if an officer found out, I'd lose my pardon. I've got to get out fast. I have small children." The woman's eyes filled with tears. After that, Godfather never mentioned dope to her again. Instead, she began pestering the other prison workers, swearing when they refused. Today, a month later, Godfather had been to court to hear her sentence. She listened in silence to the proceedings, but when she heard her life sentence pronounced, she clashed her handcuffs and shouted, "I don't want 14 years in prison. If I'm alive after that, will the judge give me a home?" She swore loudly as the female wardens dragged her away. "Hey, you bastard! You dog! Why are you giving me just 14 years? The female guards thrust her into the car and she swore all the way to the prison. Half the day had gone by the time they arrived. She was given a prison uniform and a blanket and left in barrack number 2. When she went in, all the prisoners were out on exercise. Wrapped in their black blankets and mattresses, she saw row upon row of aluminium cups. She swore under her breath, and her face, ravaged from lack of a fix, looked vile. For a while, she paced up and down, and when the prisoners returned and began to agitate in anticipation of their meal, she almost hissed with anger, "Hey, bastards! Shut up! Or I'll kill someone else and get another 14 years. Who do you think you are, you bitch?" a woman responded immediately. Godfather rolled up her sleeves and the other women had to pull them apart. Godfather fought with several other women through the night, and the wardens watched her as she tossed and turned restlessly in bed. When they were served cold chickpeas for breakfast, she stood at the front of the queue, bright and alert. "Give me some more. This lot won't even fill a corner of my belly." The volunteer took pity on her strapping frame and ladled out some more. "Me too, sister," the woman behind Godfather cooed. "If you bitches want luxury, stay at home in peace." The woman picked up her bucket. "Swear at anyone again," threatened Godfather, "and I'll smash your head." She lunged for the bucket, and though she couldn't get any food, she was lashed 6 times as an example to the other women. Then they were all sent out to work. The thrashing did not have the desired effect. The women who had fought her all of last night were making up to her now. "Sister, what have you been convicted for?" a woman asked as she sat mending a prisoner's clothes. "Sister," Godfather minced, mimicking the woman. "Don't dare call me sister. My name is Godfather, Godfather. I curse the female species. Do you know who a godfather is? A crime lord. I'm not a woman, I'm a criminal. I'm here for killing someone." Godfather announced it loudly. The other women looked at her in consternation. "Is there any dope around, my love?" Godfather whispered, sidling up to a woman who had smoked bidders incessantly through the night. "Shabratan may have some," the woman said, pointing to the prisoner because of whom Godfather had fielded the 6 blows earlier. "Any chars?" Godfather was severely troubled for lack of it. "The beady." She had begged tasted of straw. "Any money?" Shabratan whispered back, efficiently weaving her basket. "Yes." Godfather produced a rupee note from her pinafore and held it out, and Shabratan pulled out a reefer from the waist of her shalwar and handed it over. "A rupee for a cigarette?" "Yes, sir," Shabratan replied dismissively. Godfather lost her temper. "Okay, so take another rupee." Godfather grabbed her hair and pulled her close. Chaos broke out among the women. Godfather grabbed back her rupee before anyone could find out the cause of the trouble. But it was with some difficulty that the others pulled them apart. The women in Godfather's barracks soon acquired grievances against her. "She's always picking fights." Several times she was reported to the assistant superintendent with a request for her transfer. But who listened to the women's complaints? Their fights were a daily affair. Godfather was just another troublemaker. Her workload was increased a bit. But what difference would that have made to her? She dealt with the hardest job in a pinch. Finally, to get rid of her, the women of the barrack stopped communicating with her. But even that made no difference. She jibed and tormented and forced Shabratan to supply her with free pot, and though she swore she had no more, Godfather continued to freeload, threatening to report her to the superintendent. Shabratan's friend, for whom she was enduring this year in prison, managed to get piles of dope to her by who knows what means, and she got the other women addicted to it and sold it at inflated prices. But this freeloading Godfather, curse her, was a particular blight on Shabratan. Other women received visitors who secretly passed money to them, and Shabratan would question her haplessly, "Godfather, don't you have anyone? No lover or friend?" "I've got you, haven't I? You'll keep me supplied, won't you?" Godfather would extend a hand towards her shoulder and Shabratan would stand up with a start. Apart from the free dope, Godfather forcefully took a share of the food the women were brought during visits. She fought them for it, and if she didn't get it through force, she stole it at night. Then she shared it with women who, like her, didn't have visitors. When the women saw their food had gone, they beat their breasts and cried and fought with Godfather, but she didn't care a jot. Several times, she was lashed and had her labor increased, but for all her troublemaking and stealing of food, when the prison doctor visited, she lay down, groaning, "I'm so weak, doctor, I can't even manage to swallow a crust of bread. Please prescribe some milk for me." Immediately, the others contradicted her, "Doctor, she not only gobbles every crust of her own food, she steals everyone else's." The doctor grinned and left without examining Godfather. Sometimes the frailer women were given milk and Godfather swore foully at the women who had prevented her getting any. Finally, she did get herself a week's quota. That day she gloated, triumphant, "Go on, complain a bit more about me. I'll just drink my milk." She laughed loudly, tormenting them. It was customary for Godfather to fight, grab someone's hair, then beat someone else, but she had some quiet days, so very quiet she failed to respond even to abuse. Sometimes she hid her face and cried secretly, then dried her tears, menaced Shabratan, and smoked piles of pot. The days passed, the women in Godfather's barrack came and went, apart from Shabratan. Old and recent, they all knew Godfather. She still fought them for their food and drink, but she protected them from the maltreatment of the wardens. Once she even beat up the superintendent for condemning a woman to 4 days in solitary, for insolence. She beat her in the presence of all the other women. Godfather received 10 lashes for that, and her privileges were revoked. Now the women confided their woes to her. And at night when they sobbed, missing their homes, Godfather would comfort them with tenderly spoken swear words, dry their tears, share their sadness and fall silent. This evening a very young, slim woman was brought into Godfather's barrack, carrying an infant, barely 2 months old. The moment she arrived, the mother sat down on the ground, put the baby to her breast and began weeping. The prisoners gathered round her and asked why she was here. What was her crime? The mother didn't answer, crying more and more intensely. The women offered her water and calmed her, only Godfather sat at a distance, glowering. When the mother, exhausted from crying, grew silent, Godfather edged over to her, "Wonderful, my little bridie, commit a crime, then cry. If you were so frail-hearted, you should have sat at home prim and proper." "What's my crime?" The mother flared up, then resumed crying. "I've been framed." "Framed how?" Godfather asked with a bit of sympathy. "My husband married again within a year of our wedding," the mother began telling her story. "I wept and cried, but then I contained myself so that I would not deprive my unborn baby of his father. I lived like a servant in my own home. That wasn't enough for my husband. He would say, 'I want you, personally, to make up the bed for me and my new wife.' I placed a stone on my heart and did it." She sighed and dabbed her tears. "Even after that I was a thorn in his new wife's side. One day she lay down and started to scream that she had been poisoned. The whole neighborhood gathered round. When the doctor examined her, it turned out that she had taken too much opium. When the police arrived, she told them I had poisoned her. The house was searched, so was I, and some opium was discovered tied in my dupatta. I don't know when she put it there. The police took me to the station and from there to prison. I've been in another barrack since then. My father was winning the case, then goodness knows how he lost, and I've received a 6-month sentence, suspended for 3 months. Because of the baby. I'm a good woman, how will I show my face when I leave here? My father's honor has been sullied. She started sobbing again. Hun, but you ass, why did you live like a slave in your own husband's home? You should have got out the same day and got another lover and you wouldn't be here today, Godfather said passionately. Then she tugged the sleeping baby's leg and cleared her throat. You've dragged along this pup. You should have hurled him in his father's face and said, you look after him. Here, give him to me for a bit. Godfather took the baby tenderly in her arms. And here, you smoke this, she offered a half-smoked reefer to his mother. I don't smoke. And look here, don't swear at my child again. I'm here. Because of him, or I would have jumped from the roof of my home and killed myself. My baby, my baby. Who do you think you are, you mother you? Take him back. Godfather lifted the child as if he was a mouse and thrust him at his mother. Then she cursed him, secretly, for hours. That night Godfather tossed and turned, looking at the child and burbling who knows what, when usually she slept deeply, snoring, oblivious to the bites of the fleas in her blanket. Godfather suddenly reverted to the state she had been in when she first came to prison, fighting, causing trouble, being foul-mouthed. She was particularly hostile to the woman with the baby. She would snatch the baby from her, then shove him back unceremoniously. My baby. Who do you think you are, just because you have a baby? Godfather would growl, and the woman looked at her, perplexed, and hugged the child close, crying so broken-heartedly that all the women cursed Godfather. If the baby woke in the night, crying, Godfather paced the floor. Shut the little whelp up. You've dumped him on us to blight our sleep. Look, Godfather, you're picking a fight for no reason. Which child? Doesn't cry. Some woman tried reasoning with her. Then let them cry, but why destroy my sleep? Let our little bride suppress the baby's voice. And wouldn't I rather suppress your voice, the mother retorted. Trembling with fury, then sobbing helplessly. Hi! Hi! My mother. Godfather fell silent, but while the other women slept at night, she tossed and turned. One day the baby developed a slight fever. His mother was beside herself with tears. Tenderly, Godfather begged to be allowed to hold the baby. But when the doctor came, she immediately ordered Godfather to hand the baby back, insisting she would hear his symptoms from his mother. Godfather obliged, but her blood began to boil. The mother wept as she spoke. Doctor, my baby's terribly ill. He was unconscious all night, he didn't open his eyes, my jewel, his forehead was blazing like a fire. He's not had a fever or anything, doctor, Godfather butted in, resentfully. He howled all night and she claims he was unconscious. The doctor motioned Godfather to silence, examined the child, then wrote a prescription and had it administered in her presence. Today the woman's father was visiting and he brought some clothes and little toys for the baby. The woman looked pleased. My father says he's organized my divorce and I'll be marrying his brother's son, she said happily. My cousin has always been in love with me. He wouldn't marry after losing me. And everything else apart, he'll take my baby to his heart. Oh, so you have a lover, Godfather interrupted. This love thing is short-lived, you know. Don't fantasize, it won't last. Don't let it last, at least I have a son. He'll sustain me for the rest of my life. What's it to you? The woman was put out and sulks silently. Tomorrow the mother and baby will be released. Today, Godfather tried forcefully to hold the baby, but the woman wouldn't let her touch him once. Nor did she respond to her baiting. She was so happy, she could hardly sleep at night. She sang lullabies and kissed her baby, and Godfather looked wretched. "Shut up and go to sleep, you accursed creature," Godfather screamed again and again, but the woman ignored her and didn't sleep until past midnight. When she was deeply asleep and silence filled the barrack, Godfather sat up in her bed. She looked around stealthily. A light bulb shone down on her from far above. Barrack number 1, barrack number 2. Everything's fine, everything is fine. Outside, the voices of the wardens called to each other. Godfather crawled softly to the bed of the mother and baby. At dawn, the blanket was removed from Godfather's mattress. There was an uproar. The prison officers gathered round and the baby's mother beat her breast, screaming, smashing her face with stones, falling on the floor from an upright position. Godfather's shirt was tied tightly around her neck and the baby, lying on her breast, held her milkless teat in his mouth. Their eyes protruded from their orbs and their bodies were cold and stiff. The end.